The UK Financial Intelligence Unit has a national remit to analyse information on economic crime received through suspicious activity reports. This is the Financial Intelligence Podcast, brought to you by the UK FIU. All views expressed by panellists on the podcast are their own and not necessarily those of the NECC or the UK FIU. Hello, and welcome to the UK FIU podcast. My name is Alice, and I am one of the Illicit finance leads in the National Economic Crime Centre, also known as the NECC. I'm really pleased to welcome today Helen and Anna, who are representatives from two of the major international banks operating in the UK, as well as Matt, the Head of Intelligence at UK Companies House. Everyone on the podcast today has been a really active part of our public-private partnership initiatives in the NECC. Our Gimlet Plus model brings together over 200 partner agencies and private companies who collaborate against a full range of economic crime threats. And the threat groups that sit within this model are responsible for the assessment and response activity. In turn, they commission a number of time-limited cells that focus on a specific response, bringing together smaller groups of representatives. And over the past year, one of these cells has focused on illicit company formation activity. Our aim for the podcast today is to discuss the great work that members of the cell have been doing, share some learning, and why that work has been so important. I suppose it's worth us talking about the bit of context that the cell has been working in, because the economic crime landscape in the UK has been changing quite a lot recently. The UK government introduced various legislation over the past few years. Some of that has been aimed at improving transparency of information, particularly where that relates to UK companies. But essentially, a lot of the legislation is aiming to put us in a much better position to tackle economic crime. The big driver for all of this legislation is the fact that we know the money laundering threat impact in the UK is really significant. And we know that criminals have been using UK companies as a big part of their money laundering activity. We've had conversations with all of our public and private partners over the years around how criminals are using companies. And a lot of those conversations have happened in the abstract without recognition of the predicate crimes that the proceeds of crime have come from. So I think it's really important to highlight here that actually that activity isn't just transactional and there is a victim at the end of it. The proceeds of crime that the companies are moving comes from really harmful activity like drugs trafficking, human trafficking and organised immigration crime, to say just a few serious and organised crime threats. So obviously that has a really big impact on our UK economy, but also the safety of everyone who is living and working in the UK. And it's not just having an impact on us in the UK, it's a global problem. We know that overseas criminals have exploited the UK corporate regime, and UK companies have appeared in most, if not all, of the global laundromat schemes that we've seen over the years. This is a really big problem for both us in law enforcement, but across the public and private sector. So one of the big enablers for all of this activity is the fact that until recently it's been so easy to set up a UK company. If you went to Companies House a few years ago, it was actually a really quick process to set up a company and relatively inexpensive. And that's obviously really good for doing business in the UK. We want a really flourishing business environment. But what's good for business is also good for criminals. And we need to get much better having a balance between a really healthy business environment whilst also stopping criminals using our UK corporate regime. We're actually sat here nearly a year after the Economic Crime and Corporate Transparency Act was introduced in Parliament, and that came into force earlier this year in 2024. Most importantly for today's discussion, that introduced major reforms for UK Companies House, and in particular a new statutory objective to prevent UK companies being used for illicit activities. Matt, you're going through huge organisational change at the moment. How do you think the reforms are helping us to tackle economic crime?
Yeah, it's allowing us to make quite a difference. So we've now got the tools that we need to take a harder line on those people that seek to misuse the register and use companies to support criminal activity. Over time, the measures that we're bringing in will allow us to improve transparency and have a more accurate and trusted register. The first measures that came in under the Economic Crime and Corporate Transparency Act came in on the 4th of March 2024. They gave us a suite of new powers. They gave us greater powers to query information and request additional information when incorporating companies. It gave us the powers to have stronger checks on company names if we think they are being used for false or misleading purposes. There's new rules for registered office addresses, so all companies need to have a registered office address at all times, and a requirement for companies to provide a registered email address for us to be able to contact them and communicate with them. There's also a requirement for subscribers to confirm that they're forming a company for lawful purpose when they incorporate, and also confirm that on their confirmation statement on an annual basis that they will be not using their company for unlawful purposes moving forward as well. It gives us greater powers to tackle and remove factually inaccurate information, and probably more crucially in our work to support the cell here, it gives us greater powers to share information with other government departments and other agencies to tackle economic crime. We are introducing a range of new criminal offences and civil penalties, which will complement the measures introduced. So those changes will allow us to play a far increased and enhanced role in tackling economic crime. It's going well. So our priority so far has been to cleanse the register where people's details have been used without consent. So from the beginning of March, when the powers came in, to the beginning of September, we removed 37,000 registered office addresses that were used without consent. We've removed nearly 29,000 officer addresses and 27,000 addresses from persons of significant control. We've also redacted just over 30,000 incorporation documents to remove personal data, which is also used without consent. And we've removed 5,600 documents from the register, including 800 mortgage charges that were falsely satisfied. Previously, we'd have required a court order to remove, but we're able to remove them under our new powers. So I mentioned companies need to use an appropriate office address. So we are tackling that issue as well. So where companies are using addresses to which they're not entitled to use, we are changing the address to a default address, and then we're looking to strike those companies off the register if they're not able to show that they're entitled to use that address. And we're currently initiating a strike-off process at a rate of 3,000 companies every fortnight to deal with this issue as well. So there's a lot going on over the first few months of the new legislation coming into force.
Yes, so a huge amount of work that's already going on. Just going back to the Illicit Company Formation Cell, which Companies House has been a part of, this cell actually started life 2.5 years ago as the TCSP cell, when Companies House, a number of banks, law enforcement, and other partners did some analysis around high-risk formation activity. And that cell actually morphed into the Illicit Company Formation Cell, which has been taking a much broader look at the threat and has been looking at what we can do across the public and private sector to identify where illicit activity might be happening. So Helen, you've been a great chair of this cell, really driving the work forward. How have we been defining illicit company formation activity?
Thanks, Alice. So actually, you stole a bit of my thunder there. So the precursor, obviously, to this cell was the TCSP cell, but there was a real focus in that cell primarily, obviously, on corporate service providers and most importantly, postcodes, so high-risk postcodes. And I think from the work on that cell, it became quite apparent there that there's clearly lots of different characteristics and enablers that can be common and quite consistent, particularly around suspicious entities, essentially. But in relation to definition, I'm including the title, right? So we're just looking at the formation of companies that are used to potentially enable criminal activity and launder money, commonly known probably as shell companies or off-the-shelf companies, different terminology depending on who you speak to. But yes, really the cell's just been focused a lot more broadly. So rather than just postcodes and corporate service providers, we've been looking at a whole range of different characteristics, SIC codes, paid for directors, high-risk jurisdictions, etc., etc. We're going to touch on a couple a little bit later. But yeah, it was really to just take a bit more of a broader approach to try and understand the threat a little bit better, and particularly where we might see kind of patterns or consistencies. Just to take the question a little bit further as to why. So from an internal kind of bank's perspective, like we often identify or have suspicions that that there is misuse of corporate structures across a lot of our internal SAR cases. So again, kind of covering different types of high-end money laundering typologies, such as tow-based money laundering through markets, again, crossing all different types of predicates from corruption, sanction circumvention, etc. So it's clear to us from an internal perspective that this is a key risk and something that if we tackle it, we kind of get more bang for our buck because we're not just tackling a specific threat or a specific crime type. We're kind of getting a bit more of a cross-cutting result, if I can call it that. And just from an external perspective, you touched on the laundromat, but it's clear from the national risk assessments, the recent NCA, National Strategic Assessment, that this is, again, a key enabler and something that should be given prioritisation. It's called out commonly, not just obviously within the UK, but globally as a key money laundering risk, essentially. So hopefully that covers the what and why.
Yes, thanks, Helen. So I think the indicators that we've been looking at are really important, not just kind of single indicators, but the whole kind of set of indicators that together might indicate that a company is being used for illicit activity. So I'll go over to Anna now. What has the cell been doing to better understand what those indicators are? So what should we be looking out for?
Thanks, Alice. So I promise I will answer your specific question. But first, I just wanted to, I suppose, dedicate a little bit of time to promote or talk about public-private partnership activities, also PPP activities, which is a kind of broader context, I suppose, of what the cell sits in. And I think it is safe to say that the participation in PPP activities has been invaluable, at least from a private sector perspective, in building that understanding of high-end, complex money laundering, economic crime threats. That collective understanding that we garner from PPP activities is just so helpful internally at understanding those threats and, further down the line, prevention, detection, etc. Traditionally, how that's looked, you have a bunch of representatives from different banks. So banks were the first kind of private sector participants in the UK's PPP framework, together with representatives from different agencies across the UK public sector. We'd all go away internally within our own institutions and find an example or a case study where we had detected kind of suspicious activity where an illicit company was at the centre. We would all bring those case studies to the meeting on an anonymised basis, share what that looked like within the group, and then looking at them together, we'd be able to build an overarching view of what the threat might look like. So common indicators, cumulative risks, and, in many cases, again, a typology, which was really, really helpful in kind of understanding how that threat might look from end to end, how it might be penetrating the financial system, which from a banking perspective is super important. But then as well, that kind of flow of information between the public and private sector, you see the threat from both sides, which again is invaluable. What has been really interesting and valuable in this illicit company formation cell is that variety of participation has expanded. So in the cell, we've had participants from the accountancy sector, the insolvency sector,
legal, NGOs, different types of banks, a whole raft of government departments. But a key one from this cell's perspective was clearly kind of Companies House is engagement. And again, Matt, you talked a lot earlier about like the reactive stuff that Companies House are doing on the register, but this cell was really kind of showcasing what you can do proactively.
Yeah, so you're right. A lot of our work previously has been reactive, but actually one of the key things that the legislation has given us is that ability to be proactive. And I think I've touched on information sharing, intelligence sharing earlier, but actually one of the key benefits for us is that sort of feedback loop. So it's that circular ability to share that information across the system, both publicly and privately. Probably talk about some of our wider capabilities that we're developing as well. So as you mentioned, we're developing an intelligence hub. So we've invested in systems, we've invested in people to enhance our capability. We're continuing to recruit over the coming months to make sure that we have the resources to be able to tackle the issues at hand. We are developing our data science capability. So we have a lot of information, we have a lot of data. So how we can use data science to develop insights into patterns of behaviour and then use that both internally and externally to sort of tackle the issues. And then we use that across the whole system to make an impact.
And so building on just what Matt said, I suppose, and going back to your initial question, Alice. So what has the cell actually been doing? So I think a really good example of bringing the benefits of public-private partnership together with the new Companies House powers and Companies House reform within UK legislation is kind of a recent activity that one of the work streams within the cell has undertaken. Historically, the ways we've approached the threat or looked at it, the leads that we've been using have been quite moving. So a shell company, for example, an open source investigative journalist piece, is published in the media. It will name a bunch of shell companies and we will tactically take those names and go and look for it, look for transactional exposure to that specific company. We've also looked at it from, I think Alice mentioned earlier, kind of the inception of the cell was looking at higher risk company formation agents. We've taken higher risk postcodes where a number of shell companies have been registered at and, looked for exposure to that postcode, which again has given some good results, but it's very a moving threat. Whereas I think what's super interesting in this example is that we've looked at it from a different approach and used paid for directors or possibly what's commonly more known as nominee directors. This facilitator, I suppose, is more static in the sense that they change less than the names or the postcodes. The participants within this work stream all kind of went away internally and looked for an example of suspicious activity where by the shell company at the centre of it had a suspected paid for director. So interestingly, at that meeting, some of the red flags or common indicators that came out were a bit different to what we'd typically seen. Of course, more common, well-known ones were there. And perhaps the most obvious one is you've got an individual that's associated to a very high number of companies. Again, perhaps not that unusual. You've got an individual who's really quite old, so 80, 90, and they're associated to thousands of companies. Is that what you would expect? Is that viable for someone of an old age to be overseeing so many companies? Again, we saw people of a very young age associated to a large number of companies. Your more common ones, so links to high-risk jurisdictions, opaque corporate structures, open source negative news stories, or, they're registered to a residential address, which doesn't make sense for a company. But interestingly, and at least from my perspective, perhaps ones that we hadn't seen so commonly within our own institution, was kind of naming conventions at incorporation. So you had a bunch of companies that was incorporated on the same day that had similar naming conventions. So Joe Blogg's Kitchen Limited, Joe Blogg's Bathroom Limited, Joe Blogg's Living Room Limited. So they're all incorporated on the same day at the same address by the same formation agent. Similarly, we saw patterns of incorporation movement. So that bunch of companies was incorporated on the same day with the similar names. And then so collectively, they all moved kind of the next day to a different registered address, perhaps that was lower risk, that didn't have negative news associated to it when you searched it. We managed to collate a list of red flags or indicators of what a potential higher risk paid for director might look like. Bringing into context, I suppose, of how it's been really valuable having Companies House participate in this cell is that we were able to share that list with Companies House and say, this is what we think from our case studies, what a potential higher risk paid for director might look like. Give the list to Companies House, and they were able to provide us with this list of names of individuals that perhaps may fit those or do fit those indicators, and perhaps may be indicative of higher risk paid for directors. And so that was kind of the basis and how it worked within that PPP information sharing framework. But I think, Helen, it might be helpful if you provide a bit more context as to how it looked afterwards.
Thanks, Anna. I might as well join those two conversations together, because actually Matt talked a little bit about the data scientists at Companies House, and they helped us with that piece of work kind of in the background. On receipt of that information, again, the banks kind of work together on this just to try and benchmark, again, what is probably BAU for a lot of firms, but also trying to kind of test some approaches around data analytics, leveraging this kind of the cell information that came out. On a BAU basis, essentially, you take that information, you look within your kind of client counterparty populations to ascertain if you've got any exposure. If you have exposure, then you kind of undertake kind of a risk-based approach triage. And the reason for that is Alice talked about it earlier. So a characteristic, in this example, paid for director, is not an indication of suspicion. Generally, you have to have an aggregation or accumulation of these characteristics to make you be a little bit more questionable. So essentially, that initial triage would try and identify those additional characteristics. We've talked about loads on this already. Links to high-risk postcodes, links to negative news, links to diverse SIC codes. And I suppose most importantly, from a bank's perspective, do those characteristics make sense in the context of the client or the counterparty that you can see? Different approaches can be undertaken as well. So that's a characteristic triage. What you could also do is add different risk population buckets in there. So you could chuck in your transaction monitoring alert numbers or hits. You could chuck in your SARs. You could chuck in your internal cases. Again, just trying to build up a bit of a prioritization, essentially. Which of these exposure hits looks more risky? You would probably undertake an internal investigation, which would obviously mean much more deeper dive into those clients, looking at transactions, etc. I suppose the end result is either SAR or no SAR, right? What we hope happens is that SAR eventually ends up in the NCA. It feeds their longer term understanding of the threat. There may be enforcement outcome. It may even get fed back to Companies House, et cetera, et cetera. So that's kind of on a very tactical level. But then from a bank's perspective, on a more kind of systematic, strategic level, we also talked about what next. So the obvious client remediation, counterparty remediation, et cetera. But then there's also adding things to surveillance lists, understanding what that transaction looked like, feeding that into your transaction monitoring tools. There's lots of kind of tools that you can consider. Those types of tools are probably really important, particularly in spaces like this, because we've talked about why it's so important as a threat. It's cross-cutting, it's a clear enabler across multiple predicates and typologies. The reason that it's good to put effort into this, is because it's clearly a UK government priority, right? So it's an intelligence, threat-led, strategic, financial crime issue for UK PLC. So it's really important for us to understand the value of that SAR for the reasons hopefully that I've given some examples for, but also internally to try and get as much bang for buck out of that case as you possibly can by feeding that long-term solution. But that hopefully describes what we did to try and keep up with the threat and understand that threat. And then I suppose to try and give you some examples of what the benefit was, I suppose, from a private sector member perspective, but, just to give some kind of ideas on what you could do.
Definitely. Yeah, and I think it does help show at least the benefits that from the private sector perspective, how we can improve our collective understanding and better respond to it.
And I think that collective response is really important. So not only has this been really helpful for you guys in the private sector, but actually it's really useful for us here in law enforcement as well. Because what we have been able to do is share typologies, and we've had a really good feedback loop in the cell. So we've been able to test our kind of theories around criminal behaviours and methodologies, how UK companies are being used. And at a strategic level, that's really important because the threat is always changing. So using our information in law enforcement, but also your information in the private sector, we have different sets of information, but by bringing that together, we can have a much more cohesive understanding of how criminals are exploiting our corporate regime. And I think, Helen, you've also mentioned SARs. Obviously, that's a really important source of intelligence for us. And no doubt many of those reports that come in will be actively reviewed and considered for criminal investigation. Matt, it's been absolutely key to bring Companies House into this work. What have the benefits been for you?
I think being part of the cell has been really good for us. On a broader level, it's been good from that engagement part. So we've got a new change in role. So how we interact with partners, both in the public and private sector, this has been a really good experience for us. Specifically around this cell, it's given us a mechanism to share information where we see things that are suspicious. That the powers allow us to share. As I mentioned earlier, that feedback loop has been invaluable. It's allowed us to develop our capabilities. So as we mentioned earlier, we've been able to test our data science approach. We've been able to test some of our intelligence approach, so how we can identify and share that information. So that's been really important. And I think finally, it's that collective response, as you mentioned, and actually how we can then have that system-wide approach and that system-wide response to tackling economic crime. So it's absolutely the place Companies House needs to be. And you say we can play a greater role in many of the other GIBNIT cells as well as we expand our capabilities.
Yes, definitely, because it's, as we've mentioned already, it's a really cross-cutting threat. So actually, the work of Companies House is going to be really useful for us in all of our cells and threat assessment and response activity. I suppose the question that is always on people's minds is what's next? So how is the threat changing? What's on the horizon that actually I should be aware of and plan for? And that's a really difficult question to answer. We can't say with any real certainty how criminal behaviours and methodologies may or may not change, either as a result of legislative change or other mechanisms that we're implementing across the public and private sector. So I think first we need to trust the reforms will have an impact, and we'll look forward to seeing what impact those new measures will have. Ultimately, though, no one has a crystal ball, so we can't say with any real certainty what is going to change. But what we will do is continue the conversation and continue our work around public-private partnership initiatives. And that will enable us to keep track of how the threat is changing and therefore how we need to respond collectively. And that brings us to the end of today's podcast. Thank you very much to all of our panellists for taking the time not only to participate in the GIBNIT cell, but also for being here today to talk about our work on illicit company formation activity. To keep up to date with the latest UK FIU podcasts, magazines, and other guidance products, please visit the NCA website. Find the UK FIU on X, formerly Twitter, and also LinkedIn. The NECC has a presence on LinkedIn, so please do engage with the NECC too. You'll also find the full collection of UK FIU podcasts on Spotify and other major streaming platforms. Thank you for listening. I've been Alice, and this has been the UK FIU podcast.